Russia loses to Ukraine, why peace talks fail, and Russia's victory remains unattainable. As of late August 2025, Russia's war against Ukraine has been going on for over 3.5 years, with no end in sight, despite periodic diplomatic efforts. Recent attempts at negotiations, particularly those under the influence of the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump, have failed due to mutual accusations and irreconcilable demands. The Russian invasion, initially framed by Putin as a so-called special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, has turned into a grueling war of attrition, especially for Russia. It is necessary to deeply analyze the key reasons for Russia's failure to secure a so-called peace agreement that is beneficial to it and why, despite its territorial gains, Moscow is structurally incapable of winning over Ukraine. Based on military, economic and diplomatic realities, it becomes clear that Russia's excessive efforts have dragged it into a quagmire from which it cannot get out without significant concessions that Putin is unwilling to make. Peace talks between Russia and Ukraine have repeatedly failed since the start of the war, and the latest rounds in 2025 yielded little beyond a prisoner exchange. This impasse is explained by several factors, which lie in Russia's aggressive stance and Ukraine's steadfast defense. The demands that Russia is wrongly making remain excessive and non-negotiable. Russia is effectively demanding from Ukraine what it has not achieved on the battlefields: surrender, not mutual compromise. As a precondition for a ceasefire, Putin wants Ukraine to relinquish control over all of Donbass, including the territories that Russia has never been able to seize by force. This echoes previous failed talks in Istanbul in 2022 and efforts in 2025, when Russia also insisted on demilitarization, neutrality, and recognition of Ukraine's annexed territories, Crimea and Donbass. Such conditions are incompatible with Ukraine's sovereignty, as President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated that negotiations should begin with the complete withdrawal of Russian troops and Russia's responsibility for war crimes, including the Bucha massacre. This reflects Putin's obsession with bringing Soviet-era territory back under Moscow's control, where Ukraine is viewed only as a colony, not as an independent state, a Kremlin mindset that precludes true diplomacy. External influences, including U.S. policy, have complicated the negotiations without resolving them. Trump's recent calls for direct talks with Putin, bypassing the ceasefire in favor of a comprehensive agreement, have been met with skepticism in Kiev and Brussels. Despite the high-profile summits, no breakthroughs have occurred as Russia continues to bombard Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, with missiles and drones, killing scores of civilians, and attempts to advance in the Donbass. This shows that Putin will not seek peace until he faces military defeat or increased sanctions, the further imposition of which Trump has ruled out. This dynamic highlights a broader problem. Russia's strategy is to drag out the war in order to stop Western support for Ukraine. However, this has the opposite effect, as Ukraine's allies, the EU and NATO, only increase their support for Ukraine, viewing Russian aggression as an existential threat to civilized Europe. Doubts about Russia's sincerity haunt this process. Historical precedents, such as Russia's violation of the Minsk agreements, reinforce Ukraine's distrust of the negotiations. In 2025, the negotiations ignored responsibility for Russia's crimes and the suffering it caused Ukrainians, which risked freezing the conflict rather than ending it. Putin seeks Ukraine's surrender, not peace, as evidenced by Russia's continued offensives on all fronts, despite all diplomatic efforts by Ukraine and the West. It is quite obvious that the reason for Putin's reluctance to achieve peace is connected with the conditions of his physical existence. Ending the war without a victory over Ukraine would destroy his dictatorial regime, since Russian propaganda considers the invasion of Ukraine as necessary for Russia's security. As a result, peace seems distant for the time being, since Ukraine is not going to give in to Russia and give it the opportunity to avoid responsibility for crimes against Ukraine. In addition to diplomatic failures, Russia's inability to win the war is evident in its military difficulties, economic vulnerabilities, and the broader geopolitical landscape. Despite its initial advantages in manpower and strength, Moscow has already exhausted its economic and military capabilities through poor strategy and an underestimation of Ukraine's resolve. In the war against Ukraine, Russia suffered enormous losses, but did not gain significant achievements. By mid-2025, Russian troops were unable to advance along the entire front line, capturing only a small territory, but at the same time losing a huge number of people, more than 1 million, and military equipment. The Russian army, as before, relies on outdated military tactics and completely unmotivated soldiers, mostly criminals and mercenaries, former employees of enterprises. Ukraine's approach to strategic neutralization, nullifying Russian aggression by attrition, has proven effective. The Russian Navy and Air Force are obsolete, with significant losses in armor and reserves. This reflects a fundamental mismatch. Russian military doctrine is based on the massive, aimless use of artillery and manpower and cannot overcome Ukraine's adaptive defenses, including Western high-quality and high-precision weapons and ammunition, as well as NATO and Pentagon intelligence support. The very beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was Putin's first mistake, as Russia was not prepared to wage real combat operations to achieve strategic goals, such as the complete occupation of Ukraine. Without air superiority and the ability to suppress Ukrainian strikes, the Russian advance has stalled, turning a seemingly victorious war into a positional stalemate that only strengthened Ukraine's military capabilities. Economically, sanctions and military spending have pushed Russia to the brink of collapse. The Russian economy is stagnant, and military production is trying to grow at the expense of the civilian sector, but this is destroying the economy. Russia's already obvious dependence on supplies from North Korea and Iran indicates the depletion of Russian military reserves, while the decline of Russia's population and the collapse of its economy limit its long-term endurance. Ukraine continues to receive comprehensive assistance from the West, which in one way or another supports its resistance. The long war is disproportionately hurting Russia, as its small GDP, equal to GDP of Italy, is unable to match the combined resources of the European Union and the US. Putin's war economy may produce more munitions in the short term, but this depletes reserves and encourages corruption, leading to inefficiency. Russia's isolation from developed countries is reinforced by sanctions that prevent it from defeating Ukraine, which is supported by a coalition of Western countries. International support for Ukraine has isolated Russia, transforming what Putin imagined as a quick victory into the status of a global pariah. NATO's expansion to include Finland and Sweden was accelerated by the very invasion that contradicted Putin's goals. The West has never tired of supporting Ukraine, and public opinion in the West remains exclusively pro-Ukrainian, with no desire to make concessions to Russia. Putin's alliances with China and other countries provide only limited relief for Russia, as Beijing prioritizes economic ties over military engagement. This war exposes the limits of so-called Russian power. Russia cannot subdue a resolute Ukraine. Victory for Russia would require the collapse of Ukraine, but Ukrainian morale and innovation, AI-powered drones, asymmetric warfare and even own long-range rockets, ensure survival. Russia's failure in peace negotiations and its inability to win are due to Russia's overestimation of its capabilities, its underestimation of Ukraine's strength, and the West's determination to end the dictatorship of Putin and the Kremlin. Putin can hold on to the captured territory, but only at the cost of enormous effort, without any triumphant victory. As the war drags on, the Russian economy falls into deeper decline, military resources are destroyed, and isolation deepens, making Russia's defeat increasingly obvious. For the sake of a peaceful end to the war, Moscow must abandon its illusory imperial ambitions until Ukraine completely destroys Russia. This seems unrealistic, but it is very possible. Everything is heading towards this.